There are few characters I've had such a strong interest in growing up despite having no access to their source material quite like Godzilla. I've always wanted to check out some of his films, but I haven't come across many of them for most of my life. Well, today's my good friend Nemesis Bloodright's birthday, and Godzilla's one of his favourite things on planet Earth. I haven't been able to do anything big for his last few birthdays, so I decided I'd finally get into the series to make a little first impressions video for the occasion. All 38 officially produced Godzilla feature films as of this recording. From the original 1954 classic that started everything up to the 2024 blockbuster Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. Are you supposed to say the X in the title? I actually don't know. Should go without saying, but that does not include any re-edits like Gigantus the Fire Monster. And now I'm gonna go over what I think of them all. Before I get into them, I should probably give my very brief history with which of these films I've seen before to give you an idea with where my familiarity on the series was at before this. The first one I ever saw was actually the 1998 American Godzilla film. Yes, shameful I know. Which I have next to no memory of outside of it was bad. Then I saw Shin Godzilla when it was on Sky Movies around 2017 to 2019, I don't remember exactly when. I watched King of the Monsters in the cinema in 2019. Later that year I checked out the original King Kong vs Godzilla since my friends covered it on a podcast episode that they were doing. I caught the 2021 Godzilla vs Kong when it came to streaming during lockdown. Saw -1 when it came to theaters, which I briefly talked about in this video. Then went back through the whole Monsterverse in preparation for GXK, including my first viewing of Godzilla 2014. Then finally checked out the original 1954 film before I saw New Empire in theaters the day after that. Everything else I didn't just mention, my first viewing of was after I wrote this intro. I had a few different ideas for how to approach this. The obvious ones would be to review all the movies, either chronologically or ranked from my least favourite to my favourite, but then that has the issue of the project either being way too long to be manageable in the timescales that I have, or I end up repeating a lot between segments. The approach I decided on was that to make the video digestible for both our sakes, I'm going to cover each era as a whole, make note of any personal highlights in each one, and then rank all the movies at the end with a very brief summary of my thoughts on each one. And if you want to remind yourself which films are in which era, you have access to Wikipedia, good luck with that, champ. Okay, intro over, let's talk about the big wizard now. Starting off with the Showa Era. This is a weird one where it's much larger than any other era, taking up 15 of these 38 movies when none of the others go beyond 7. And yet I have very little to say about it because I find a lot of them end up blending together. Not in a way that stopped me from having my share of fun with it, but once you remove the singular huge outlier from each side of the quality spectrum, not as many of the movies stand out to me. The original film is obviously fantastic. I really loved how dark in tone it got to get across its messaging about the dangers of nuclear weaponry, as well as the grief that Japan felt after World War II. And then pretty much nothing else afterwards even got near it, opting to instead make itself much more accessible to kids for some reason. Sometimes it makes them goofy and silly in a fun way, and other times it made them all monsters attack, which only serves to be a PSA to school children about standing up to bullies. Which ends with the kid joining the bullies, so it can't even do that right. The rest of it is just dream sequences and reused stock footage, with the only half decent bits being stuff you can get more out of by rewatching Home Alone instead. And then the other 13 films are mostly a split between fairly fun and fine but forgettable. The extent to which I like each of them differs, but they mainly have the same sets of pros and cons. The suits are pretty well made, giving a kind of charm that just isn't possible with modern day CGI, and the brawling between the monsters tends to be pretty fun to watch, even if it can sometimes wear out its welcome after going on for ages. The human characters aren't exactly the most riveting or memorable out there, but I did find myself enjoying quite a few of their storylines and wanted to see how they'd play roles in the final battles. Some of them did get a bit repetitive though. You can only do the aliens infiltrating the Earth and Godzilla's gotta stop their big monster shtick so many times before it starts to feel played out. Not helped by the constant reuse of stock footage to pad out the run times. Watching them in quick succession only made it even more noticeable and jarring. That feeling of repetition is likely why my favourites of the era are what they are. Other than the original 1954 film, which is obviously my favourite by a landslide for having the characters and story I find the most compelling, I was really drawn in by Mothra vs Godzilla for introducing one of my favourite kaiju in the series with a really unique way of fighting, Ebera for the unique surfer rock score and the fun story of the guys surviving on the island, which I'm told is basically just the format for a James Bond movie that happens to feature Godzilla, and versus Hedorah for being absolutely batshit insane, with the most unique presentation of the entire era, and even many of the parts that weren't technically good still having me captivated. Those are the only 4 of this era that I'd say I fully loved, but I still enjoyed plenty of the rest. And even the ones that I didn't like rarely got to the point where my opinion was skewed to fully negative. Many of these movies have a ton of slow stretches in both the human and monster sides of their stories with nothing of interest happening. They lack much of an identity to help them stand out, and the sound design of the monster roars can get really grating after the 100th time you hear them in each scene. But absolutely none of them are devoid of things I enjoyed, from charming character interactions to attempts at emotional beats that landed, to jokes that legitimately got me to laugh more than I anticipated. And even though they can feel dumbed down at times for the sake of being accessible to children, most of them do have things to say about mankind and our impact on the world, about nuclear weapons, capitalistic greed, pollution, not surrendering our freedoms to oppressive invaders. They may be subtle as a brick, but the messages are there, and I'm sure they'd do great for getting a younger audience to think on them. I'm writing this segment before I've begun watching the next batch of films, and it does seem a little all over the place without much cohesion between everything. Though to be fair, the movies are kinda like that too, rarely having a whole lot to do with each other. Not sure how that'll apply to the future eras. At the end of the day, I can't say I was amazed by the Showa Era outside of its debut, but I did still enjoy my time with it. Above all else, it's got a level of charm that I don't expect the later films to capture to the same extent thanks to the homemade feeling the suitmation gives it. And any technical errors like visible wires only endear me rather than killing my immersion. I'd recommend giving some of them a watch if you haven't already. I watched them on Tubi, though I think they've been removed since then. I see that they're on Crackle and the Criterion channel. I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't know how that'll change in the future, so just look into wherever you can get them and maybe give some of them a watch if you're interested. Moving on to the Heisei Era, this is what I've heard gassed up as the best collection of films in the series, with all 7 of them seeming to be fairly well regarded, and some of them like vs. Biollante and Destroyer being considered some of the highlights of the Big G's career. When you take the original 1954 film out of the equation, which remains my favourite up to this point, I prefer the bulk of these movies to most, if not all, of the Showa Era. Even vs. SpaceGodzilla, my least favourite of them by a landslide, still barely cracks the bottom 5 so far, not even being a movie I can say I outright fully dislike, because it has plenty of redeeming elements that apply to this entire era. On a production value standpoint, everything is taken to the next level compared to how it was before. The Showa stuff still had more of that early cinema charm to it, but I can't deny the increase in quality of the suits and puppets. The sets are way bigger in scope, and the vastly improved practical effects and pyrotechnics make it so much more satisfying to see buildings get absolutely demolished by the dozen. I also felt like the sound design of it all sold the weight and scale of the monsters way better, even when they're just off walking in the background. The kaiju themselves were awesome. The returning favourites were really fun to see, with me preferring all of their movies to their Showa counterparts, even if I do prefer Showa Mechagodzilla as a kaiju to the Heisei one. And the new faces here are so great and iconic despite never showing up again. In the movies at least, I'm aware that they're in some spin-off material. Biollante's sympathetic and tragic, Batra's a great counterpart to Mothra, Mecha Ghidorah was a neat direction to take the character in after I wasn't too keen on how they changed his origin. Mogira really stood out to me for how it could split into 2 different machines, and also its name is really funny. SpaceGodzilla is a mix of dumb and cool in a way that really works for me, and Destroyer's rad as shit. What an amazing and menacing design for the embodiment of death and destruction himself. All these memorable monsters and great practical destruction effects of course result in plenty of fun kaiju brawls that feel much more thought out than the kind of basic wrestling stuff present in many of the Showa outings. Sometimes they could feel a little too over-reliant on standing still and firing lasers, but that's a hell of a lot better than the same rock-throwing shtick for the 20th time. Speaking of overdone Showa tropes that Heisei avoids, there are no alien infiltration/invasion plotlines. At least, not in the same way. The Futurians in vs. Ghidorah are more than distinct enough from what we've seen before, and SpaceGodzilla can't exactly be counted as the same sort of thing. In fact, I really enjoyed most of the storylines present in this era. Shiragami's grief over his daughter's death leading to him continuing her research which ends up creating Biollante, the leads of vs. Mothra being a divorced couple who want to support their daughter, Azaza in Mechagodzilla 2 acting as a mother figure for the baby Godzillasaurus before he properly became Godzilla's surrogate son. Most of these have solid emotional cores that kept me invested. With that said, I do wish that more of these characters could have been recurring rather than tossing most of them out and starting from scratch with a new cast in every film. Not that I think recurring characters are required, anthology stories can still work, but with these movies I felt they would have benefited from keeping more of their main leads around for longer. We couldn't have had the Super X or Mogira pilots return to keep fighting against Godzilla, Azaza couldn't have come back to see how Godzilla Jr. had grown. It kind of resets my emotional investment with each movie. They do have some mainstays like the army guy and particularly Miki the psychic, and if the latter sounds interesting, she's really not. I like her fine, but she's mostly just there in the background and doesn't have a whole lot to do despite being in every single one of these films besides Return. Her telepathy doesn't play as much of a role as I'd like, and it just starts to fade away between films off screen. She rarely has any involvement in the final battles, and I'm still kinda salty that she's the one we see getting all teary over Junior's death. She barely interacted with him before. Why are we not getting a scene from the woman who took care of him when he hatched? That would have hit so much harder. Coupled with how the X3 pilots here are a bunch of randos, I think it does hold versus Destroyer's human elements back somewhat. Which is a shame because even with that caveat, it is still unsurprisingly my favourite of this era. The Godzilla side of the story with his nuclear meltdown set to kill him and the entire rest of the planet gave the story high stakes and plenty of emotional weight. If the human stuff was able to match it, I honestly think this could have surpassed the original 1954 Godzilla. Versus Ghidorah, Mothra, and Biollante are also highlights, far surpassing most of the Showa films for me. Versus Mechagodzilla 2 and Return are very solid entries as well, which says a lot that they're on the lower end. It is a remarkably consistent selection of films. The other one doesn't matter, don't worry about it. I mean, I'm happy for you if you like versus SpaceGodzilla, it's perfectly valid to do so, I just personally don't. While I can't say this hits the same heights as the previous era, I can say that I love the Heisei Godzilla movies and that they're generally far better than most of what we'd previously seen. Versus Destroyer in particular would have made for a perfect swan song to both the character and franchise. I think we all know that's not how things turned out. We got an American version of the Godzilla story, famously considered to be one of, if not the worst in the series. And yup, what little nostalgia I have is not gonna save this one. Frankly, I only included this in my marathon out of obligation to say I covered everything, and also a genuine curiosity to see if it was really that bad. I have no intention of giving it its own dedicated deep dive segment. Any reasonable bad thing that's ever been said about it is true. The redesign of Godzilla is horrendous with even worse CGI, most of the characters are bland or unlikable with quite possibly the least convincing lead romance I've ever seen in my life. It is so unfathomably, relentlessly unfunny that it boggles my mind. It's awful, you know it's awful, it's Godzilla 1998. I know it has plenty of fans and people who say it's pretty fun if you can separate it from the Godzilla brand, but for me, even if you separate it from trying to be a Godzilla movie, the experience of watching it is still so miserable and overly drawn out. I've seen worse franchise films, don't get me wrong, but I just hated this. The most enjoyable part of my viewing experience was when I paused it halfway through to go make spaghetti for dinner, which meant I got to spend an hour not watching the movie. Maybe the real lots of fish were the friends we made along the way. It was so bad that Toho felt like they had to start making Godzilla movies again in response, even making several jabs at the film, declaring this monster to not be Godzilla, and having the real deal outright kill it in less than 15 seconds. Which leads us nicely into our next era. The Millennium Era is possibly going to be the toughest to talk about as a collective without just reviewing everything individually, because almost none of them take place in the same universe. 1954 is canon to the majority of them, but aside from the Kiryu duology, they're all off in their own little worlds that don't influence each other. I guess to get started on the overall quality of the movies, if I didn't know the reputation half them had, the start would have left me very worried. 2000 was a fine movie, far better than the American version they revived Godzilla in response to, but he wasn't exactly back with a bang. It's not a particularly exceptional one in any way. And then versus Megaguirus was the most bored I'd been with one of these since All Monsters Attack. I like Megaguirus itself and it has a great fight with Godzilla, but those are wasted on such a nothing plot that set up a potentially interesting story about grief and blaming yourself for the loss of the people you care about, only to not do anything with it. So not the greatest first third. You know why I wasn't too concerned about the rest of the overall era though? Because I knew what people had said about the rest of them and they were absolutely right. GMK gave the series a shot in the arm with the most emotionally resonant story and coolest new take I'd seen on Godzilla in decades. For the first time in my marathon, actually delivering on something I liked more than the 1954 classic. And then the Kiryu duology? Against Mechagodzilla is literally just versus Megaguirus if it locked the fuck in. Akane is the character I wanted Kiriko to be, and it's so powerful to see her go from a loner with survivor's guilt to someone who's able to build trust with her new team and gain people in her life to fight for. There were parts of that final battle where I legitimately wanted to get up and cheer. Absolute cinema. Tokyo SOS didn't hit quite the same though. It's nowhere near the worst Godzilla movie, I like it just fine, but in a vacuum it's a bit standard and unremarkable, and as a sequel to the previous banger, it really drops the ball by reducing the characters I grew to like from the last movie to cameos at best and cutting them completely at worst, with the new ones being nowhere near as interesting. It being a direct sequel to the original Mothra film was neat though, even if I haven't seen that one yet because they took it off Tubi by the time I was getting around to it. And they don't develop Kiryu's sentience as much as I would have liked. Still, made for a very nice ending with the old Godzilla bone saving humanity from the new Godzilla as one last act of kindness, and then bringing itself back into the sea so that it can rest in peace on the ocean floor. Then we close out with Final Wars, just 2 hours of the most batshit insane action scenes the series has ever seen. Yes, it's another alien invasion plot with the same species from Astro Monster no less, but it is not the same as the others, not by a long shot. They don't waste your time drawing out the twist. People figure it out very quickly and we get right into the thick of the sheer madness with plenty of time left to go. Both the monster and human fights are awesome. It manages to be both ironically and unironically funny. The juxtaposition between some performances being so over the top extra and completely emotionless had me reeling. I wanted to give a standing ovation when they did the title drop. It's so fucking peak, dude, just watch it. It has stuff to say about how those with power are corrupted by it and the value of fighting with a purpose to save people instead of succumbing to mindless violence, but the draws here are the action and the absurdity of the story, and in that regard it knocks it out of the park. It's the Avengers Endgame of Godzilla. Not one of the most narratively sound or compelling things out there by a long shot, but insanely fun, chock full of fan service, and an absolute delight to watch that closes out this saga perfectly. As for overall points for the era, this is where they started making a lot more use of CGI. And yeah, it's definitely dated and not great, but it rarely ever got distracting. They normally manage to hide it with lighting decently well, and even when they don't, these aren't the kind of movies I feel are held back by shoddy looking effects. In the same way as the visible wires and obvious miniature sets for the practical side of things, some of the early rough CGI gives it its own special charm. I guess one thing I can say this era doesn't deliver on as much as the others is cool new kaiju to add to Godzilla's rogues gallery. Cool new takes on old classics, sure. Kiryu's the best Mechagodzilla by far. Ghidorah gets 2 awesome incarnations with his heroic status in GMK and the new Kaiser Ghidorah form in Final Wars. I know the latter's technically not Ghidorah, but you get the point. Gigan's way cooler than before, Manila was tolerable, so on. But they don't have a ton of new faces. It's only really Megagyrus, who I like, but the big bug concept is not a new one, and Orga, who I had to Google. I guess you can count Monster X if you want. I don't know if I would, but either way, he's pretty cool. Bit of a shame given how many bangers that Heisei was able to introduce, though I also understand that GMK, Final Wars, and the Kiryu duology likely didn't have the room or any real reason to bring in new faces. So all in all, I'd say the Millennium Era was able to find their footing and deliver on banger after banger once they got past their initial rocky start. Tokyo SOS was a bit of a letdown to me, but that still leaves half of this era being among my favourites in the whole franchise. GMK is my new favourite up to this point in the marathon, and even though Final Wars probably isn't as technically good as many of the others, it still found a spot in my personal top 5. Hard to say if I prefer this to Heisei or not, since it isn't quite as consistent, but it does have 2 films I like more than that entire era. I could go either way, they're both great and I love them. After that was 10 years of the franchise being dormant, at least on the theatrical side of things. A decade later though, a new era would start with both an American Hollywood cinematic universe being kicked off, as well as an entirely new era of Japanese films that were very different from what we'd seen already. Since the former was what started sooner, let's talk about that first. In some ways, I have a soft spot for the Monsterverse movies, since they were kind of my first big experiences with a franchise that I really got into. And I do like all the movies in it, I had enough fun with them all, but at the same time, I don't love any of them. And that's not because they're not as ambitious or deep as the ones considered fan favourites. The beauty of this franchise is that it can put out a genuine masterpiece that emotionally resonates with everyone, or it can be less ambitious, fun spectacle action, and these movies don't try to hide, at least in the later ones, that they're the latter. On the kaiju spectacle side of things, these movies have plenty of great tense action, though each one comes with its own strengths and weaknesses. Godzilla 2014 has some pretty effectively threatening antagonists in the Mutos, and the fighting we do get to see is cool, with a couple of really brilliant looking shots that get across the sheer scale of the creatures. But the key phrase there is what we get to see, because not only is the lighting not great, there also just isn't much of it in general. This movie gets its rocks off by teasing you with the setup for big monster fights, and then cutting away back to who cares. That airport battle being summarized in a news report is downright insulting. King of the Monsters luckily has a lot more action and it is all pretty solid, but it has similar visibility issues through the dark and murky weather at parts. Godzilla vs. Kong thankfully picks up the last two slack, providing a satisfying amount of action that's both exciting and visually stimulating. I especially love the Hong Kong fight. I can see Kong fans maybe getting a bit bothered at how dominant Godzilla is in the fights, with the only round the lizard debatably loses being one where he gets up and is fine immediately after, while Kong gets thoroughly beaten to near death twice. But I don't mind that for reasons we'll get to later. And then GXK New Empire weirdly feels like a step back. The action is good and doesn't have any visibility issues, but weirdly doesn't feel as weighty or anywhere near as tense. Scar King and Shimo pose solid obstacles for Kong with how the former outmaneuvers him and the latter debilitates him in one shot, but I never once felt like they had any chance after fearsome evolved Godzilla entered the picture, since he's way stronger and showed that being frozen meant nothing to him. I can only be so annoyed though when most of the action is really fun. The anti-gravity battle was great, and it was pretty funny when Kong weaponized his adoptive son, which is even funnier when you realise that Suko is taller here than Kong himself was in Skull Island. Now, after praising the monster stuff, I hate to bolster the stereotypical kaiju good humans boring reputation the Godzilla franchise gets saddled with all the damn time, but a lot of it seems to come from the Monsterverse, and that is not undeserved. 2014 has a really gripping first act with Bryan Cranston losing his wife, carried by an incredible performance. Turns out he's a really good actor, who knew? But then he dies and we follow Tangerine Bullet Train for the rest of it, who has a few charming scenes and I like when he looks after the kid on the train, but he's not all that interesting and can't fill the void that Cranston left. King of the Monsters is panned for its human cast, and yeah, I can definitely see it. I don't share the hatred everyone has for Wife Lady, whose name I don't care to remember, but her commentary on man is the real monster never gripped me at all. Her husband's a little better, and I like that he has to overcome his grudge against Godzilla killing his son to help him out in the final fight, but otherwise he did little for me. Their daughter is also really boring, and the rest of the cast really needed to shut the fuck up with their D-tier MCU humor.
My God, Zilla.
Please stop, I'm on my hands and knees. I did kind of enjoy the villain, who unfortunately hasn't shown back up since, and I did like Ken Watanabe as Dr. Serizawa. The scene where he sacrifices himself to recharge Godzilla was genuinely kind of beautiful and made me feel some stuff. The scene after of Godzilla reconnecting with humanity through the crew on the boat was pretty neat too. The score was grand and pretty and I liked it. Overall though, not a very strong cast, and I wish they didn't keep cutting back to them to interrupt the fights. That killed some of the momentum and stopped me from getting as into the action as I wish I could have. Godzilla vs. Kong has some better human stuff, but that is not on Godzilla's side at all. Madison from the last movie has gone from uninteresting to really annoying. Same with Lemon Bullet Train and Russell Deadpool 2. Their humor fell flat 90% of the time and I did not care about any of them. They also waste the really interesting premise of Serizawa having a son who pilots the machine that nearly kills Godzilla. It's never emphasized, he gets no character moments, he sucks. Kong's side is pretty good though. Mostly it's just your average bunch of Joe Schmoes that I forget about immediately, but his connection with Gia is actually pretty sweet and I enjoyed getting to see them interact. That continues into New Empire, which I believe to have the strongest overall human cast in the Monsterverse. I once again liked Gia's connection with Kong, but also with her adoptive mother who has to grapple with the idea that her daughter may be happier living in the Hollow Earth with the Iwi tribe. Is her defying that expectation and staying with her real family the most predictable thing ever? I mean, kinda, but I thought it was sweet, sue me. Trapper was also a delight of a character. Just a ton of fun whenever he's on screen. Lemon was a lot better too. Still the obvious weak link of the main cast who gets no real resolution to his arc of maybe we don't need to broadcast everything on the internet, but he played off of Trapper better than he did with the annoying children, so I could put up with it. Now, before I close off this section of the video, I'll say that while I have enjoyed these movies, you may notice that I've been more positive towards Kong's side of things than Godzilla's, despite Goji being the one to kickstart it. And yeah, as much as I enjoy him and his fight scenes, he just doesn't have as much interesting to do. Kong is not only backed by a much stronger human cast, but he is my favourite solo Monsterverse movie while being the highlight of their crossover since he's typically given some level of emotional hook. When he signaled "I lost home" to Gia, that actually made me kind of sad. Godzilla doesn't get much in that department outside of getting crankier after Mothra's death and before she comes back. He also doesn't serve to be as compelling of an allegory as his predecessors and isn't as charmingly goofy to make up for that. I didn't need these to be on par with the best of the series to like them though. Again, none of these 4 films are series highlights, but they are all still fun watches. Even 2014, which has a reputation of being boring, still has enough enjoyable scenes to make it not a chore to get through. They're not not high art or anything, but frankly they're doing a lot better than about any other cinematic universe out there right now, and I find that very funny. Now here we are with our final set of films to cover, the Reiwa Era. And as much as I'd like to talk about these collectively, the live action ones are striving for very different things, and the anime trilogy is even more different from them, so I kinda have to take them all separately. But I'll be as brief as I can so we can get to the final ranking. Starting this era off is Shin Godzilla, widely considered to be one of the top 3 best Godzilla films across almost every ranking that I've seen, and I can absolutely see why that is. It gives a very interesting look into the Japanese government's response to a Godzilla attack, criticizing the pitfalls of bureaucracy and how it can delay getting citizens the help they need in a crisis. That's a very fresh take on the human side of a Godzilla story, and if you want to call it one of the best, I would not argue against that. Personally speaking, for my own taste though, I tend to prefer when these movies are able to get me to grow attached to the humans and strengthen my emotional investment. Something Shin Godzilla doesn't do, because that's not what it's trying to do. That's totally fair, I respect what it's going for and I do still like it. It just means that inherently it does not play as well to my preferences, and so it won't rank as high on my list as I imagine it would for many others. The Godzilla side of things on the other hand, I do love. He's not in it a whole lot, but I love the concept of this ever-evolving creature, with that horrifying final shot showing what he could have become if he wasn't stopped there and then. Conceptually, this is probably the scariest version of the character to date, helped by one of the best atomic breath scenes of all time, harrowing in a way unlike any scene in any previous entry. I can't say I fully love this movie, but I do still really like it, and there are some all-timer moments in among everything. Then I'm going to follow that up with 5 words you probably would have never expected to hear from a Godzilla fan. The anime trilogy was bad. Godzilla's barely in it, the animation style does him no favors by having him look like a dollop of grey sludge who moves like he's wading through molasses. Any cool ideas they introduce end up being grossly underutilized. I didn't grow to like any of the human characters. The love triangle sucks, the whole trilogy builds up to a deeply unsatisfying ending. I do not like these movies. They're far from the worst movies I've ever seen, hell they're not even the worst Godzilla movies, but they're entirely dull and lifeless experiences that I don't think are worth the time to watch unless you're actively seeking out every movie in the series like I did. They drag the Reiwa collection down so hard. The era isn't out for the count though, because following that up is one of the fan favorites, Godzilla -1. And spoilers, but it's my favorite as well, like, by far. It marries the most terrifying and intense Godzilla scenes in this series, feeling so much more up close and personal than any other version of him, even if Shin is conceptually more horrifying, with the most compelling human plot out of them all. An endearing cast of people I grow to care about, making me care more for their safety when they're in the thick of a Godzilla attack. A gripping plot about survivor's guilt, making our main protagonist Koichi easy to sympathize with and relate to his fear of death. And an especially effective message about the value of continuing to live. No matter how bleak things look, and no matter how much you may think you don't deserve it, there will always be a reason to keep going. It's a movie where I cared about the characters so much that even though my suspension of disbelief was pushed a bit by the ending, I could easily look past it because of how satisfying it felt to finally see these characters get a glimmer of hope after the horrors they had to endure. Oh, and this is my favourite atomic breath ever put to screen. For as fantastic as Shin's is, the one let out on Ginza is just on another level. The build-up had me on the edge of my seat even on a rewatch. It is unfathomably good. I need to stop myself here, otherwise I can and will yap about how much I love -1 forever. It's a movie I struggle to put into words how much I adore, and yet I would still say many if given the chance. It is the only Godzilla movie where I'd go as far as to call it one of my favourite movies in general. As much as I adore the original, GMK, Final Wars and so on, I'd go as far as to say I love -1 more than all of the others combined. Unfortunately, I don't think even -1 can save Reiwa from being my least favourite era by default, since it's the only one where I don't like a majority of the films. Thanks, anime trilogy. Given enough time though, I don't doubt that it will change once it has more films to its name. -1 and Shin have shown that they're interested in taking the character in new directions that have worked wonders for me and more seasoned Goji fans. I cannot wait to see what Takashi Yamazaki does with him next. I will be there no matter what. And now here we are at the ranking portion of the video. To reiterate what I said in the intro in case you forgot, or skipped it, I'm going to be going pretty rapid fire here. Only a couple sentences tops per movie. And while that won't allow me to be super thorough, I do have a bit of a compromise. In the description, I've linked a letterbox list with the ranking I'm about to read out, potentially slightly different if any of my opinions have changed since making this video. If you want to see more in-depth thoughts on any of the individual movies, you can go into that list and jump to my diary entry for any movie from there. It means more reading on your end if for some reason you really care that much about intaking any more of my waffling, but it also saves me dozens of hours recording and editing a 4-hour video, so I think the trade-off is fair. Just keep in mind before we start the ranking that a lot of these are bunched up super close in quality to the point where I could swap some of them around and not even notice. And that these are almost all based off a singular viewing. I'm not nearly as experienced with Goji as many watching this video probably are, so I'd imagine many of my opinions would be subject to change on rewatches. Actually, outside of the letterboxd averages and a few ranking videos I've seen before, I generally don't know what the consensus is for a majority of these films, so I've got no clue how well most of my takes will match up with the fandom. If I go against the grain for anything, or just have a flat out dogshit take, which is entirely possible, then let me know in the comments. I'm sincerely curious to get some other perspectives here. Oh, and for transparency's sake, while I was able to see most of these subbed via Tubi, the Criterion Channel, Pluto TV, and Netflix, there were a few that I had to seek out dubs for, sometimes having to go to the Internet Archive because Pluto TV either skipped that movie or wasn't cooperating with my VPN that day, or sometimes Pluto had it and things worked fine, but they only had the dub for some reason. Plus, I rented Shin Godzilla on the Microsoft Store, which for some reason only came with the English dub. Thanks, that's so cool. So for that versus Destroy It and the first 4 Millennium films, I did have to watch the dubbed versions, but I've tried not to let that influence how I feel about them. If any of them are bastardized in these versions, then please let me know because I am none the wiser. I did see the dub of Raids again too, but that's an entire re-edit to the point where it's essentially a different movie. And I did watch the original Japanese version later that day anyway. Gigantus would be dead last on the list if you're curious. Alright, preamble over, time to start ranking. 38, Godzilla 1998, that sure was a lot of fish. 37, All Monsters Attack. Fails as a movie because most of it is dream sequences and stock footage. Fails as an anti-bullying PSA for children because it ends with the main kid picking a fight and then joining the bullies anyway. 36, Godzilla the Planet Eater. For an hour, it's whatever, and then the last act is maddening. The final fight is like 3 actions stretched out to 20 minutes, and it constantly keeps cutting away to the equally uninteresting human stuff. This whole trilogy led to such an unsatisfying payoff, did not work for me at all. 35, Godzilla Planet of the Monsters. Intriguing opening, incredibly raw ending, almost everything in between is boring angst that I could not get invested in. 34, King Kong vs Godzilla. Probably lower for me than it is for most people, but I found the majority of this kinda boring with only a few funny moments here and there to keep my attention. I like the last 25 minutes because the fight is fun and it has some satisfying payoffs, but I don't think it was worth the journey to get there. 33, Godzilla vs Mega Gyrus. The new titular kaiju is actually kind of enjoyable and I like the fight it has with Godzilla. Unfortunately, the rest of the movie failed to hold my interest. It sets up an interesting story about survivor's guilt, but then doesn't expand on it in a satisfying way after the intro. Somehow they managed to make the plot with the insane premise of a satellite is built to shoot black holes at Godzilla one of the most boring things in the series. 32, Godzilla Raids Again. Probably only as high as it is because I had the English bastardization re-edit fresh in my mind before I watched the correct version, making this look way better in comparison. I also had fun watching this in a call with Nem. This is the only one I did that for. The movie itself though is not very good, but I guess my feeling towards it is mostly flat neutral rather than outright negative, even if it does skirt pretty close to that line. 31, Invasion of Astro Monster. Might be a hot take, but this didn't do much for me. The opening act is solid, but then it drags its feet a lot after that, not keeping me all that interested by the end. Love the Godzilla victory dance though. 30, Godzilla City on the Edge of Battle. Shockingly way higher than I expected any of the anime trilogy to get. Still didn't really like this one, the cool concept of Mechagodzilla City is not used to its fullest at all, but this has its moments, parts of the ending go kinda hard, and it didn't actively get on my nerves as much, so this gets to be my favourite of the trilogy. 29, Godzilla vs SpaceGodzilla. We could be doing all lot worse for the weakest Heisei showing. I like the titular SpaceGodzilla. His design balance is dumb and clunky with genuinely cool, and he has some interesting powers. I'm forever grateful that there's now a Godzilla equivalent to Batman Magic Crystals. But I didn't get too into the story of this one, and the action is not one of the stronger showings of the series. 28, Son of Godzilla. A very mediocre movie for the most part, with an ending that I got shockingly swept up in that managed to elevate it a few spots higher than it probably would have gotten otherwise. It wasn't nearly as annoying as I expected. It probably has one of, if not the worst Godzilla suit in the series though. 27, Terror of Mechagodzilla. This is the cutoff point where I like every movie from here on out. A lot of this is flat average to me, but my opinion of it is elevated up to slightly positive by a few strong emotional moments and fun bits of action. 26, Godzilla vs Megalon. If Godzilla vs Gigan's so good, then why isn't there a Godzilla vs Gigan 2? This one's enjoyable enough, if soured a bit by the kind of egregious amount of reused stock footage. Big fan of the dropkick though. One of the greatest Showa Godzilla moments of all time. 25, Godzilla vs Gigan. Fun in the first half, I like the humans here, shout out to Corn Guy, then kind of drops off a bit with a less engaging second half and some hit or miss monster action. 24, Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Kind of a standard Godzilla movie on its own merits that isn't a particularly satisfying sequel since it reduces the Against Mechagodzilla cast to cameos and then sends them away instead of continuing their stories. Still, I like it, I wasn't bored watching it, and the ending is very nice. 23, Godzilla 2000 Millennium. Decent revival for the series after Hollywood made an ass of themselves that doesn't really excel or stand out in any major way. I like it, the visuals fascinate me enough to stick with me somewhat, otherwise not one of my favourites. 22, Godzilla King of the Monsters. The pieces are there for a really fun movie. I like a lot of the action, I just wish it was clearer and that it didn't cut back to the humans so often. It's also way too long given how little investment I had in the story. Serizawa sacrifice is the exception, that shit was peak. 21, Godzilla 2014. This is more or less tied with King of the Monsters. Has a really strong opening act, the rest of it is fine with the few bits of monster action selling the destructive scale amazingly, just not super investing, and I wish they'd kept Heisenberg as the main character because he easily has one of the best performances in any of these movies. 20, Godzilla vs Mechagodzilla. I was kinda bored during the first half hour or so I was worried that I wouldn't like this one. Thankfully it picks up later on, especially with the final battle, which may be my favourite in the whole Showa era. Could have climbed up an extra 10 spots or so if it didn't take so long to hook me. 19, Godzilla x Kong The New Empire. A mix between dumb fun action schlock and some genuinely kinda compelling drama on Kong's ends. Shame that Godzilla's got on the short end of the stick in terms of having anything going on outside of being the big strong guy who hits other guys. 18, The Return of Godzilla. A very strong introduction to the Heisei Era. As much as I like the goofy Showa campiness, this returning to the roots of the original and trying to more closely match its darker tone is very much appreciated, even if it doesn't excel to nearly the same extent. 17, Godzilla vs Kong. Very mixed bag in terms of the human story, elevated by the best action in the Monsterverse. Love the fight scenes in this and how overwhelmingly dangerous Godzilla feels as the antagonist. The team up against Mechagodzilla legit made me want to cheer on my first viewing. And I'm not including Skull Island on the list, but I would rank it either directly above or below this. Whichever one I prefer switches depending on the day. 16, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Cool intro for the titular Hydra with some fun team-up monster action and even some human gunfights that aren't half bad and give this one more of an identity. The story isn't the most riveting out there, but it works well enough. The Venus Lady concept was an interesting enough hook. A good time overall, just not a top tier entry. 15, Shin Godzilla. If you were looking at this from a critical standpoint and put this near the top, I 100% get it. Ordering it by my subjective enjoyment though, it is a bit lower for me than I imagined it is for most. It's good, I like it, but I only really love some of the Godzilla sequences. The rest of it doesn't click with me quite as much, even if I appreciate the different angle they approach the story at. 14, Destroy All Monsters. Tons of fun monster action in this one, bringing in pretty much everybody Toho could get at the time, and it's a blast seeing them all team up to body Ghidorah. I like the human storyline with the astronauts too. Anytime it started to drag, it would grab my attention back with a really strong dramatic beat or funny joke. All in all, this to me is just a better version of what Astro Monster was going for. I really enjoyed it. 13, Godzilla vs Mechagodzilla 2. Dumb title aside given its relation to the Showa films or lack thereof, this is a pretty solid take on the big robot lizards. While I find the Showa one to be much cooler, this one as a movie did resonate with me a bit more since it has that emotional core with us as a raising the baby Godzillasaurus. Their goodbye at the end shockingly really moved me, and the action was pretty fun too. 12. Ebera Horror of the Deep. Okay, this is one of the few times where I know I'm placing it way higher than anyone else would. This is basically just a James Bond movie that happens to include Godzilla, in a role that you can kinda tell at parts was initially meant for Kong. The characterization for him is way off base from what it normally is, and the titular Ebera isn't around much. All valid reasons to dislike this movie, but they're what make me love it. I love the goofy silly charm of the island infiltrations, the amount of personality they managed to give to the monsters, and the surf rock score really stuck out to me. 11. Godzilla vs. Biollante. Probably lower for me than many others would have it, but I still love this one for having one of my favorite kaiju in this series. Biollante is such a well-designed monster, with a tragic origin being the vessel for Shirogami's deceased daughter. That tragic aspect makes it so much more satisfying when she's able to take Godzilla down and rest peacefully in the end. The corporate spy stuff is fun, and I like the messaging about how scientific advancements can be used for good or bad depending on who's using them and for what reason. I wish I was more attached to the other humans so I could feel more at the big emotional moments. Other than that though, I have no major complaints. 10. Mothra vs. Godzilla. Helped a lot to reinvigorate my interest after the first few Showa films besides the original were starting to lose me. This one's really fun, introducing one of my favorite kaiju to Godzilla's world, while also having something to say about capitalism and over-commercialization of everything. Big fan of Egg Guy. It's only held back by an overly long final fight with really repetitive sound design. 9. Godzilla vs. Hedorah. The word I most commonly hear used to describe this one is psychedelic. So damn weird in its presentation that it fascinates me and gives me a genuine admiration for the creativity that went into it. It's a mix of genuinely compelling and ironically hilarious that honestly could have gone for a spot in the top 5, if I didn't get tired of it halfway through the overly long and repetitive climax. Still, it was all worth it for the atomic breath flight scene. 8. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Does the time travel stuff make sense? No. Do I care? Not especially. I had a blast with this one. The Futurian story feels different enough from Showa's overabundance of alien invasions, and I got as much enjoyment from the humans here as I did with the monster fights. Not just feeling the dramatic beats, but also in terms of comedy. The Spielberg cameo, the random go-ahead make my day reference, practically everything M11 did who may be the funniest non-Douglas Gordon character in the series. I was having a really good time with this one. I'm not as huge on Ghidorah's new origin story, but Mecha Ghidorah is fucking awesome. 7. Godzilla vs. Mothra. Not to be confused with Mothra vs. Godzilla, of course. Not as funny as its Showa counterpart, yet it manages to maintain its momentum to the end a lot better while conveying similarly effective messages about capitalistic greed. This one also looks a lot nicer, and I found myself even more invested in the family dynamic of the main human cast. 6. Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. That last act had some of the biggest I want to get up and cheer moments in the franchise. Not only were the awesome fight scenes kicked off with one of the sickest entrances of all time, but also for how powerful it is to see Akane go from a loner to someone who's able to build relationships back up and keep going now that she has people in her life to fight for. Absolutely fantastic stuff that massively elevates a movie I thought was just standardly pretty good for most of its runtime. 5. Godzilla vs. Destroyer. I'm a little let down by some of the human elements not being as compelling in this one. Something I can easily look past when this is some of the best Godzilla content out there. One of his best designs, the best story throughout the whole Heisei Era with the ticking clock provided by his impending meltdown, one of his all-time greatest foes in Destroyer, and an incredibly powerful ending that would have been the perfect way to send this pop culture icon off for good. Allowing him to die while his son absorbs his radiation, continuing his legacy since the threat of Godzilla exists for as long as nuclear weaponry does. 4. Godzilla Final Wars. Exceeds even versus Hedorah in terms of sheer weirdness. 2 hours of absolute off-the-wall batshit insanity. Not nearly as narratively strong as a lot of the ones below it, but I had so much fun with it that I'm putting it this high anyway. Whether ironically or otherwise, there was not a minute of this movie where I wasn't enjoying myself. 3. Godzilla 1954. What else needs to be said about the original classic? Love the dark tone and how Godzilla's rampage is like a nuke going off in slow motion, showing the horrors Japan had to face as the target of nuclear weaponry in World War II. This is fascinating, both as an allegory and criticism of this kind of weapon being made, and as an early piece of cinema making great use of suits and miniature sets. If you haven't seen it already despite sitting through this video, you are sorely missing out. 2. GMK. I'm not reading out that full title, happy for you or sorry that happened. Utterly shocked me with how much I loved this one. The new take on Godzilla being a collection of souls seeking revenge on Japan for their actions in the war is so intriguing, delivering on a great message about how countries shouldn't just sweep their mistakes under the rug. Godzilla's design in this with the whited out pupils is sick. He feels like a more actively malevolent force of destruction. His fights are awesome. I love the other kaiju in this, and Yuri Tachibana is one of my favourite human characters with a much more emotionally resonant story than I expected. I couldn't stop thinking about this one the day after I saw it. It's so good. And number 1, Godzilla -1. The Ultraman My Favourite comic panel says more than any other ramble I could ever go on. I adore -1 with all of my heart, and it stands out as my favourite film of the decade so far. It deserved all of the praise it got and then some. Alright, so there we go, my thoughts on every Godzilla era and my overall ranking of the series. I had so much fun going through this franchise. There honestly weren't as many low points as I expected. Generally, the worst that most of them got was just a bit boring. I rarely hated watching any of them, while I loved quite a few. I'm glad to finally say that I'm a fan of this big dumb lizard after being interested in him for most of my childhood. And I'll definitely be keeping up with each of his new adventures on the big screen whenever I can. There are a few things that I'm looking forward to as much as Yamazaki's next outing with Goji, regardless if it ends up being a sequel to -1. I hope you enjoyed hearing me yap about this movie watching journey I went on over this last year. Let me know in the comments what your favourite Godzilla movies are, or if there's any non-movie Godzilla media you'd recommend checking out, since that's mostly uncharted territory for me as well. I think the only thing in that department I've experienced is the GBA fighting game. I think I've gone on for long enough, so I'll close this out now. Thanks for watching, and if you're watching this on the day it releases, then be sure to go wish Nem a happy birthday. Alright, balls in your court now, Nem, to make your own Godzilla ranking. Do it, you won't, cowards.